It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Marcelle SAUL SHEIMAN. We're here in your beautiful home in Herzliya. And Marcelle, you're going to speak about the African experience.
Thanks, Les. I really appreciate it. And good day to the audience, colleagues and friends. I'm most grateful to the sponsors of this talk, the University of the Witwatersrand Alumni Relations, Telfed, the South African Zionist Federation in Israel, and World Mizrahi, as well as to my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Les Glassman, Wits University alumni representative in Israel, seated here together with me. What a privilege. Thank you, Les.
It's a privilege for me.
And Mr. Larry Pfeffer for providing me with this platform, together with Mr. Roy Scher from Jerusalem, who is the representative of Telfed in Jerusalem. I was called upon to give this talk. The talk was entitled at first as a statement: the situation in Africa, lack of drinkable water, food, sanitation, energy, basic medical support and education, with a statement as to the potential to help. And I looked at the title of this talk and indeed wanted to give over a little of my experience with Africa. Africa, in my experience, is the beautiful, the magnificent, the place where miracles happen and do happen, Africa. I added a question mark to this particular title. Is it so? Africa, with all these deficiencies and the potential to help? Africa is a big word to swallow. Africa cannot be described as one country or one place. It's a continent with not necessarily common factors between each country. The title is also meant to play into the hands of those who see Africa with a sense of misery and human disaster. Africa and Africans as victims needing aid. Incredibly enough, this also plays into the hands of aid agencies, creating a single distressing picture of Africa image. And this is also something that we on the outside have in the past, and we still do today see and have been schooled upon to see via the media regarding Africa. And whilst that is the impression and case in some African countries, there is so much more to convey. The title in its statement form is incongruous to that of my experience. I can convey that as a South African and also through my personal and business experiences. Africa has weaknesses but opportunities and huge potential. And to play into the hands of those who regarded such a title as a statement, I wanted to bring you some statistics in terms of, yes, lack of drinkable water across Africa. You'll come across a statistic of nearly 1 billion people in Africa who don't have access to clean, safe water. That's 1 in 8 people on the planet. Poverty in Africa often being caused by a lack of access to safe water. And some of the reasons given are climate. Only 10% of the total African population living in the valley of the second largest African river, the Congo, and its most single significant source. The place where people live, if one lives, of course, in a bigger city, you have more access to the villages where water is basically mainly brought to the family by young girls and women, leaving no room for education. Non-safe water sources, agriculture, which employs up to 60% of the working population, where 95% of farmers rely on rainwater. Government and conflict, and just like with oil, where you find that water spills over countries, the impact of corruption, mismanagement of resources, bad investment. But understandably, in line with all of this, in line with this deficiency, a growing global demand for clean water, more stringent regulatory issues, and increasing environmental concerns and wastewater treatment systems. Reading up on food insecurity, you see the same causes: poverty, conflict, climate, etc. Africa's energy poverty. Africa is actually very rich in energy resources, but most of that potential on the continent is unexploited. To date, the continent, with the richest solar resources in the world, has installed only 5 gigawatts of solar PV, less than 1% of the global total. There's also a huge need for policymakers to address the persistent lack of access to electricity and clean cooking and the unreliability of electricity supply. Estimates are that by 2040, more than 25% of Africa's total energy will come from clean sources. Despite that, it is home to 17% of the world's population, but currently accounts for just 4% of global power supply investment. More effective use of public funds is needed to catalyze private capital, and basically mobilizing this level of investment is a significant undertaking requiring a lot of policy and regulations and will to make things happen and change. Africa is also home to many mineral resources that drive global energy transitions. The DRC accounts for 2/3 of global cobalt production. South Africa produces 70% of the world's platinum. Robust regulatory and oversight mechanisms are needed to ensure that revenues produce positive results for local communities and minimize negative environmental impacts. And lastly, on healthcare systems. 5 African countries have been quoted as doing well in attaining universal health coverage: South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Rwanda. Rwanda, the country's budget ensures that the health sector gets over 20% of funding. There's been literature quite outspoken by the need by African governments to take the Abuja Declaration seriously, a pledge made by AU members to increase the health budget to at least 15% of the state's annual budget. When you look at the defense budget, you see state-of-the-art military equipment going to countries being bought. So it's not about poverty, it is about genuine political commitment and goodwill. Recent studies have highlighted deficiencies in health systems across the world, but across the continent of Africa too. And just one statistic caught my eye: less than 1 intensive care bed per 100,000 people across Africa. And COVID-19 is a case in point. While such African countries as Tanzania and Burundi chose to simply ignore the dangers of the pandemic, or lagged on testing or contact tracing like Nigeria, South Africa did everything by the book. In March, it instituted one of Africa's heaviest and strictest lockdowns, if not in the world. 5 months later, the country had the world's 5th biggest outbreak. South Africa's COVID-19 crisis collided with its ailing economy and dysfunctional politics, a fight between lives and livelihoods. On the medical front, South Africa must deal with COVID-19, even as the country has the world's biggest number of people infected with HIV and one of the world's largest number of tuberculosis sufferers. Above is some of the less interesting part of what I really wanted to convey. My take on the African continent is, it comes from a very different place. From being South Africa, my exposure is one, and that's definitely the subject of a different talk, but also from my experience as Anthill. Anthill was set up as an entrepreneurial vehicle in 2013 to capitalize on the 21st century sub-Saharan African opportunity by focusing on various sectors such as infrastructure, financial services, and oil and gas, and bringing together entrepreneurship together with opportunity and money in Kenya. It was founded at a time where 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa, and the continent was increasingly moving into the global limelight as a promising investment destination. Hence, I was doing research on the Asian tigers versus the African lions. And today, currently, the continent is home to 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. Ethiopia is the fastest growing economy in Africa and the 2nd fastest growing economy in the world. Its economy has experienced strong, broad-based growth compared to the region. And whereas it is currently struggling with low per capita income, it aspires to reach lower middle income status by 2025. To propel it forward, it has invested heavily in the manufacturing hub and attracting foreign direct investment. Rwanda, the 3rd fastest growing economy in the world. The small, hilly, landlocked and densely populated nation with a GDP size of close to $10 billion has bounced back since the infamous genocide of 1994 decimated its economy. It has not only ensured political stability, but has rehabilitated its economy better than the pre-1994 period. We are seeing substantial improvements in living standards and social development, life expectancy and reduction in poverty. And of course, rounding out the top 10, we have Cote d'Ivoire 7.3%, Djibouti 7.1%, Senegal 6.9%, are the next three fastest growing economies. Of course, some of the poorest countries in the world are in Africa. So it's an interesting question as to what is required to transition a country from being mostly agrarian, with a huge population living in rural areas with low productivity, disease, high infant mortality, lack of potable water and poor infrastructure, to a highly urbanized one, where citizens enjoy universal access to health, education, housing, high productivity, strong service sectors, and freedom of movement. Within decades, many Asian countries made this transition, and some African countries are well placed to make this transition too. Most of this achievement is attributable to seemingly miraculous growth, but in fact, there's been a discernment of the factors that have led to this growth. The improvement of the average household income, which improves when the largest number of people are involved in technology-based productivity work. Even agriculture needs to be high-tech and include, for example, agro-processing. This is the path currently being taken by Ethiopia. Secondly, state intervention and robust national leadership are required. The economic strategies of successful countries were influenced by leaders who were committed to rapid development. They had a focus on growing human capital. This in turn led to increased productivity, household income, and general standard of living. Time frames, we focus on the long run, examining the economic trajectory of some of the countries between 1960 and 2016 shows that it can take about 25 years to attain this. Another key factor among the Asian tigers has been their investment in their youth. But the youth need education to be academically and technologically ready to explore the boundaries of knowledge and technology for their own benefit and that of their countries. Africa should exploit their youth dividend. It is its most important resource. Empowering is not about giving money or resources, but an open door policy which will create room for youth to discover their potential. Youth are not security threats, but are leaders of tomorrow. They need to be involved in nation building and programs that seek to improve their well-being. Participation leads to ownership. I love that phrase. It is interesting because social media reflects what happens in real life. If you don't have a robust, healthy dialogue in society, it will be reflected in the social media. And we've seen the transformative power of social media. Young people in Africa live in very interesting times in which they can help in transforming their countries and societies. There is great human potential there and great national resources in Africa. Africa's greatest resource is her people and her youth, and empowerment of women is also key. Women in Africa are mostly employed in informal activities. We all know what this means: low productivity, low income, low prospects. There are the constraints: access to education, credit, markets. The gains to be made by overcoming these constraints are immense, particularly through girls' education. An African saying goes as follows: if you educate a boy, you train a man. If you educate a girl, you train a village. I came from a country which could teach the world about transformation, transformatory power, and yet there is still a long way to go. I went to Kenya, where I saw pride of people. What did I see in Kenya? I saw a strong connection to the community. I saw entrepreneurship, a vibrant private sector benefiting from a very well-educated and entrepreneurial workforce, private equity funding sources, incubator hubs for great startups within Africa and for Africa, with a need for African technologies that can share with the world its own entrepreneurial spirited lessons. African technologies so focused on digital for rural penetration in the way of the new world. I visited Angola, Angola is a most magnificent country. I saw private investment build farm to fork operations and transform places in the south ravaged by war to growing towns with banks and shopkeepers and women buying their own cars, and a whole enterprise being responsible for a third of Angola's egg production, where the main retail distributors and supermarkets import around 80% of everything they sell. Those investors made very well on their money. They did good, but they did well as well. I also traveled to Luanda and saw the squatter camp just outside the city, with one of the highest, if not the highest, rental rates in the world. This was the main reason of mine for visiting the country. You see, during the first decade of the 21st century, Angola was one of the fastest growing in the world, relying on a strong oil dividend and diamond sector, although with high inequality and vast corruption. Nearly a third of all Angolans are illiterate, and many support themselves as subsistence farmers. My belief is that so much depends on leadership and investment in Africa's most amazing people. And those who come to Africa, of their need to be humble and be more in touch with the people, seeing reams of social housing projects being built and being abandoned, where they look more like prisons than homes, and realizing just how out of touch some of those who come to Africa are in terms of the fact that they see the Africans as beggars. And sometimes the locals see themselves as beggars as well, and not as the beautiful rich people that they are in the countries that they have. Getting lastly to the question or the exclamation mark. The challenge of poverty reduction is in creating wealth. If one says poverty reduction, one is talking exactly about the aid phenomenon, medicines, food relief, peacekeepers, and they're not productive but treating symptoms. Wealth is a function of income, wealth creation, and entrepreneurship, putting money where it can grow private wealth and knowledge. As I've heard it said, you never become rich by holding out a bowl and turning a place into a charity case. Aid is not destructive. Feeding a village is not destructive. The mistake is the ignoring of the norms and the habits for a village to succeed, to utilize opportunity and turn it into benefit. We lack institutional and policy frameworks to make it possible to benefit. Despair and hunger, although part of the reality, is not the only reality, but the smallest part of that. There are 53 nations in Africa with conflicts in only 6 countries. Africa is currently the youngest continent in the world. By 2050, more than half of the world's population growth will be in Africa. The size and pace of growth is unprecedented and will bring with it equally unique challenges and opportunities for Africa. While there will be an even greater strain on the resources, there will also be an immense supply of potentially entrepreneurial youth to help solve problems facing the continent. In Africa, the lack of infrastructure means a smartphone is often the best way to access everyday services or finance, or start a business. This has propelled the continent to the forefront of the new digital economy, leapfrogging over the rest of the world with such solutions as M-Pesa and Ndela. Today, Africa has 16% of the world's population and just 2% of the world's doctors. Yet this undersupply has created a market for new health tech companies aiming to plug the gap, from Silicon Valley zip lines to Rwanda baby. From Alibaba to Google to Microsoft, companies are waking up to the opportunities in Africa and also creating programs to nurture talent and empower entrepreneurs. There are amazing programs like eFounders Program, Netpreneur Prizes, Forum of Young Global Leaders, created to empower Africa's young entrepreneurs. Not only to succeed in their own homes, but to return home and demonstrate to others how to build inclusive business models for the digital era. There is much to highlight in the scale of potential the continent holds in tapping into youth and entrepreneurship to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, over the next decade, as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Let us not forget some fundamentals of what is today required to survive and prosper in this world. I've heard it being called AI, adaptability quotient, or even survival quotient, resilience and courage, in line with the intense capability and capacity of the African people to bear suffering and bounce back, and their capacity for healing and hope. Thank you.
So Marcelle, I really want to thank you most sincerely. Your insight into the African continent is so profound. We are so grateful that you've been and you still are the chairman of the Israel South African Chamber of Commerce. And it's just so wonderful to hear the hope that you give and your research and your understanding of the African continent. And this will give hope to everybody out there that the old saying, darkest black Africa, you give hope. And it's shining, emerging Africa. And I really want to thank you for a most very insightful and wonderful talk.
Thank you, Les. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so very much.